You've reached the Signal Watch, movies, television, comics, and more. I'm your host, Ryan Steens. Join me and our cadre of co-contributors as we examine cultural artifacts of the 20th century, boldly explore the 21st, and try to put it all in perspective. Stay tuned. We're gonna try to make this work.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Signal Watch. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Steens. With me today, I have not one, but two guests. First, I have a brand new guest with us.
Michael Bell.
Michael, thank you so much for joining us. I'd never actually met Michael before about 10 minutes ago. We've been talking online for a while. You are a friend of the other guest, who is...
Marshall Freddy.
You guys know each other, I believe, from college days?
That's correct.
College days. English at U of H.
Yep. The wilding days of fall 93-ish, right up into the time period, certainly, that we're recording today, but definitely the stuff that we're going to be talking about today. So,
Yep.
And you are, by trade, you're actually in the video production industry, right?
I am. I co-own a video production company in Houston, Texas, South Coast Media Services. There's the plug. And I have been, when I went to school, I took all the film classes. University of Houston had a, middling radio television department back then. It was perfectly good and they were great educators, but everything was sort of spread out. And I think my experience now is a little bit disconnected from real life. It wasn't something you were going to go through and come out the other end being ready to, tackle the world of media. But there were lots of things that you can do. And I took all the classes that let me go to the movies as a form of education. And as a result, while I was at school, we spent a ton of time sitting around, not going to the other classes and talking about movies. And I have fortunately turned that into somewhat of a career. So I'm very blessed in that way.
Excellent. I was trying to think. I think Laura is the only other person who works in any way related to the entertainment industry of the other folks who are on the podcast. But you have selected a Canon film for yourself today. And what did you choose?
I picked Danny Boyle's Shallow Grave from 1995. And certainly 1995, by the time I got to see it in American theaters, as I was doing my research for it, it was a little fuzzy when it actually came out, the way film festivals and UK releases and so forth. But absolutely 1995 for American audiences.
Yeah, I remember the movie coming out and going to see it at the Village Theater in Austin, Texas at the time. If you haven't seen it, we're now doing recaps, actually, thanks to Michael. He pointed out, hey, it'd be kind of handy if you occasionally explained what the movie's about before you got started. And I was like, by gum, that's not a bad idea. So this film, do you want to give it a shot? Do you want to give it the 25-cent recap?
Absolutely. I'll go at it.
Okay.
Shallow Grave, which it stars Carrie Fox as Juliet, Christopher Eccleston as David, and a brand new baby actor named Ewan McGregor, as Alex. And this was, if not his first, his second movie that Ewan McGregor did, and it's Danny Boyle's directorial debut. It is the story of three roommates who have an amazing flat in Scotland. They can afford it. One is a doctor, one is a reporter, one is an accountant, and they have a fourth room that's open. And so these people, what they do for jollies is invite people to audition for the fourth room, where they proceed to make fun of these people. And at one point, they actually interview a fourth person, Keith Allen, who plays Hugo, who comes in and is not at all bothered by them and their jokes. He can hold his own, and they allow him to let the room. He comes in, he keeps to himself. They never see Hugo, and they finally get curious about where Hugo has gone. They burst into his room and find that Hugo is dead, and also that Hugo has left a giant suitcase of money. And the movie ensues from there, and it causes all sorts of hilarity and terrible, terrible, terrible decision-making by all parties.
Marshall, when did you first see this film? Did you see it at River Oaks, or what was your experience?
So I saw it at River Oaks. I had worked at a movie theater in Spring, the Lowe's Spring 10, which I know you know, Ryan.
Oh, I know it well, man.
And I decided to move downtown. And right as I was moving downtown, I started working for the landmark River Oaks 3. So I got a job down there, parlaying my movie theater experience into a new job at the Art House movie, the storied River Oaks 3 in of course, River Oaks. And my first night there, probably my first or second night there, we were, my boss built up the movie, got it ready to go. It was coming out the next day. So this would have been a Thursday. And so Thursday night at midnight, me and several other employees at the landmark River Oaks 3 were able to watch the film while, in the theater. We all got high right before we went in. We all smoked the devil's weed, and then went in and had some beers and watched the movie. This was my introduction to working here. It's my second night on the job, and it was awesome. It was we screened it just for ourselves. It's a miracle I did not fall asleep during the movie. But I probably have better memories of seeing the movie in the sort of circumstance under which I saw it that first time than I did actually remembering the movie. But it has been basically since then, since I saw it. I may have seen it one other time in the last, 30 years since it came out. But that was the first time, and the first of many times that I would watch a Thursday night midnight screening at River Oaks of a new movie right before it came out, with probably under probably not the best chemical circumstances.
Michael, so I think you said you'd also seen it at River Oaks as a customer.
I did. So I saw it probably within days of Marshall having seen it. And, as I've listened to, I love the Canon series on the podcast. And I just sort of, the way my commute works, I get to listen to the Signal Watch, kind of just fits into the right bit. And so I'm able to consume large amounts of it, probably more than I should, but I go through my bouts, and I love the Canon ones. And so it as a listener, it caused me to sort of start asking my questions. What are my Canon films? And there is no doubt that, I am a man of a certain age. I grew up in the 80s. My dad took me to the movies. My mom made sure I saw the classics, which meant Disney films. My father would, without any warning, tell me to get in the car and would drive me to the movie theater. And when that happened, the movies that you wound up going to see were like Indiana Jones and Goonies and War Games and The Last Starfighter and Back to the Future. And, it just never stopped. And so I have these deeply romantic feelings about going to the movies and being taken to the movies. And then when I'm in high school, I'm old enough to date. We had a great dollar theater. We had a lot of movie theaters. And again, those movies are good. So you can take your date to go see Beauty and the Beast and, these kinds of movies. So I've always loved going, enough that somehow I signed up to take movie classes at school. But as I thought about my Canon, man, what a great time to be one or two semesters into thinking about movies critically and differently than 1994, 1995, because boom, it hits, right? And so while I love the movies that I grew up on, that everyone loves that they grew up on, my Canon kept taking me back to this time when the movies were coming out and they were fresh. They were on the lips of people. They were absolutely on the lips of people who were sitting around talking about movies, who were prone to talk about movies. And interestingly, 1994, October 94, you get Clerks, you get Pulp Fiction. Obviously, before that, Quentin Tarantino had already made his mark a little bit. He's coming up into it, and he really blossoms and just explodes with Pulp Fiction. And I liked those movies, and I liked the time and the narrative and everything that was about those movies. But I feel like the culture has done everything that it needs to do for them. We all know, everyone has seen them. They're all right there. But for me, it didn't really stop. Those movies keep going in the sense that, this podcast was almost a double feature because I think of Shallow Grave and I think of Peter Jackson's first sort of serious normal movie, Heavenly Creatures. In my mind, they were back to back. I virtually could have seen them the same week. And we saw them, and together those movies absolutely blew my mind because they were good movies. They felt like our movies. They felt like a now movie. And what was interesting, as I did my research, I found out that those movies are separated by my ability to watch them by about 2 months. So my Canon was actually a bit of a personal mythology that I uncovered. It didn't quite happen that way. And Marshall and I talked offline here a little bit, about it's possible that the schedules could have overlapped a little bit more, but I don't really want to get into that. The truth is I saw these. I remember walking out of Shallow Grave feeling absolutely electrified by the movie on the heels of another movie that I had seen. And unlike sort of what happened culturally around Pulp Fiction and Clerks, specifically those two, these didn't feel like movies where the director was bending you towards their personality. They didn't feel like, you go see a Tarantino movie, you are always sitting in the theater with Quentin Tarantino, whispering in your ear. And when the movie's over, part of talking about the movie is also talking about whatever that guy likes and whatever he is like. And Clerks is very much sort of the same thing. Those movies are just tattooed onto the personalities of those directors. But with Shallow Grave, since that's the one we're talking about, Danny Boyle is a brand new director. Now, he's done stuff in European television and theater, but I don't know what that is, at that point. And I'm getting this movie from somebody who is making something where there is a bit of precedent. It's not the first time you've ever seen a crimey potboiler, trust, distrust kind of murder mystery type thing. But he made one of those and he put his flair on it. I do not want to give the impression one bit that when you watch this, you won't go, I'll bet that's the guy who made Trainspotting, because one thing that we can talk about is this movie is absolutely very much the blueprint for the next movie, which is Trainspotting. But I felt like these were movies that were sliding into the larger cinematic conversation, and they had precedent. And so now you could have a conversation about, violence in movies or any of the qualities of this. And the conversation didn't have to stop at Taxi Driver. It didn't have to, these movies were worthy of film critique. It felt like they belonged right in the conversation, and they felt like they were for us, for people who were new. Like now you could participate in something that you were too young. Otherwise, everything else you sort of learned in books or when people handed down to you. Oh, this is a good movie. Oh, it's 20 years old, but man, what they were doing back then was something, and it blew everyone's mind. Well, I'm walking out of a movie theater. My mind is blown. I liked those older movies, but I felt like oh my gosh, someone is doing it now too. And the subject of film critique, the subject of cinematography, and boundless creativity, I could have that conversation with things that I got to experience for the first time. It didn't just stop with the classics, wherever you want to draw the line for that, but also it didn't have to delve into, you could talk about the movie itself. You didn't really have to get into who the director was, who the writer was, what were the conditions by which this film got made. And, did you see him doing the twist with David Letterman and all the stuff that kind of went with those directors who had a lot of celebrity built into who they were and how they marketed their movie.
Yeah. I mean, I know when I was going through film school, there was definitely the hard push of the auteur, which has really weirdly percolated through the culture, to where, people are like, well, I don't understand what a producer does. And you're like, well, the producer does the work. That was, in fact, the fact that movie exists in any way, shape, or form, and probably much more of the vision than you're ever going to understand, was the producer.
I've never loved you more than this moment. You're a good guy, Ryan.
You can use that as a bullet on your webpage.
Verb on there, yeah.
But it's such a collaborative process, and that just never really gets recognized. It's one of the things I actually love about some of the ways Eddie Muller talks about noir is he never talks about it from an auteur theory. He will talk about the impact the director had on the film, but what were the conditions of the screenwriter? What were the conditions of who was producing it, the studio? What kind of horse trading happened to get the actors in? These movies, we didn't know any of that stuff as it being fresh stuff. I similarly remember going to see this movie, but it was by virtue of it being part of this wave of indie cinema, and knowing that if I went to the Village, there was a 1 in 3 chance I was going to see something pretty solid, just because of the era that we were in with indie movies.
Absolutely.
I absolutely loved it. And I remember telling people, you got to watch this film. I wouldn't say it hit me in quite the same way, but it's something it was a movie that when I have not seen this movie probably since 97, but I remembered every scene of it as I was watching it. It clearly just stamped itself scene by scene through my brain, as it was unpacking. I was like, right. This is how this thing unfolds. It's a great crime movie. So of course that appeals to me in some ways. But yeah, it's a great indicator of what was going on at that time and the talent that was coming out. And I very much appreciate, what you're talking about as far as the movie can almost appear without context around it. We didn't yet know who Danny Boyle was. Train spotting hadn't happened.
We don't know who Ewan McGregor is.
Right. David, Christopher Eccleston's many years from being Doctor Who and me remembering that guy exists.
Carrie Fox is actually top billed in this movie because she's the only one who had any cred. She had appeared in is it Angel at My Table? She appeared in some of the right kind of art films and the right kind of stuff at that time. And it's funny because I remember her name. I remember one of my friends that I went to the movies with was a bit of an Anglophile and was enthusiastic about her being in the film. I know who that was. And over time, I have not seen Carrie Fox in more things. I have seen the other two actors in several things.
Yep.
But when I went back and watched it again, and I just want to say for the listeners, even though I picked this movie, it is sort of for what it did to me, and that the way it burned itself in my memory of that time. But I have not seen this movie 20 million times. I haven't seen it at least in a decade. I don't own it. I don't know all the words. But like you, as I'm watching it, it's just those images are so well done. And I think the pacing of the movie is correct. No, well, not perfect. When it's doing what it's doing, they're in total control. And all that stuff was just burned in there. But going back and watching Carrie Fox in this, I was astounded. You still watch it and go, oh, you're the best actor in the room. They let her, she gets the nuance. She gets to say things with her eyes and tiny things. And she's got a secret in our movie. And I think she handles it extremely, extremely well. But Marshall, I want to let you get in on this, obviously. But I feel like this is a movie, as you said, Ryan, it's collaborative. This is Danny Boyle making a movie of someone else's script, and someone else is the DP, and they brought in these actors. They had very little money, which is I love the discipline of that. I read a little bit about Danny Boyle reflecting on this movie. He still, to this day, still operates with a certain kind of budgetary discipline. He won't take more than 20 million pounds or something to make a movie, because anything more than that, you got to start asking for permission, and it becomes more of a conversation with people who are not on set than those who are. And so, here's a guy who's going to go off. He can make any movie he kind of wants to. He's got Academy Awards sitting on the mantelpiece, and he likes that. I found that I really love, here's a small movie that's got essentially 3 or 4 characters moving around in it at any given moment. You shoot it in an apartment almost exclusively. And the way you make that not totally boring is with good actors and a really great director of photography who can come in and say, all right, this is all we have to work with. Let's do it. And you get that. You get these nods. They live at the top of the apartment building, and there's a spiral staircase sort of thing. And the first time we see it, the camera is looking up at the top of it and rotating, and it looks like an eyeball that is staring down at you, which will later on, one of our characters, that will be his only view of the people that he lives with, is his eyeball staring down from above. Maybe we can go into the plot or something if we want to find out what that's about. But, that kind of thing where you go like, oh, that's why they did that. It's amazing. This movie has a ton of it. And it hit me on all those levels as something that was extraordinarily masterful.
We say a lot, I think, on the podcast and in conversation that, a lot of the stuff that made the 90s era indie film that all went to TV. But it didn't, because TV has the need to fill arcs, right? And I don't think anyone would have the patience for this as a 10 episode something. I mean, I can't imagine how it would sprawl.
Sometimes 89 minutes with these 3 people is enough.
Yeah. I mean, and there's a few things I wanted to unpack, and then I'll hand it over to Marshall. But you said that this is kind of the movie for us, kind of, and I think that's beyond just that it was fresh in the 90s as a kind of Hitchcockian thriller, but in that it, what had been aimed at us from the studios was stuff that has not aged well. What's the Winona Ryder Houston movie?
Reality Bites.
Yeah.
Which is in my notes. I originally intended to introduce Ewan McGregor's character as Ethan Hawke from Reality Bites.
I mean, if you watch Reality Bites now, it's, as I think, Marshall's kids would say, kind of cringe. It's it's a hard thing to go back and go, did I like this? And, I think about things like Threesome and the other things at the studio was like, how do we reach these Gen X kids? Cause they think everything sucks. And this was how I felt reached. And, at the time, this is also the same era, and this is a bit of a jump, but this is the same era as Seinfeld, with absolutely reprehensible leads, right? I mean, we all love the Seinfeld cast, but they're all watch reruns. They're terrible people. And that was the whole joke at the end of the show, right? And this is about, from jump, as they're going through these auditions of these roommates, Danny Boyle is not screwing around. The screenwriter is not screwing around. Like we want to know at the beginning. It's not a slow reveal. It's like they're a bunch of, narcissistic whatevers, maybe David less so. But at least the other two certainly are. And so, we were a little bit more open to that idea of not necessarily being relatable back then. Or, why is everyone having to have all their edges knocked off so that they kind of become a fiction suit that we can all imprint ourselves on. I don't relate to any of the three characters in this film, and I don't care. It's completely irrelevant. I'm watching them do their thing.
Yeah, and they are awful people, and we get that from the outset. And so to some extent that is there so that we don't mind watching their demise and watching them, just completely fall apart. It's weird because, you kind of get the feeling at first, like I've never had a roommate situation that was like this. I didn't sit down and make dinner for my roommates just as a thing that happened because we were all sort of around and we didn't, I just didn't ever live in a situation like that. But they do, and they don't really like each other either, but we'll find that. I hadn't thought about it as turning the sort of 90s trope on its side at the time that it was happening as a response to that. But
I don't think it was, I don't know if it was a response to that, but maybe it was. I haven't asked Danny Boyle or the writer, but it absolutely, of the things that were coming out of like, here's young adults living their lives. I mean, I probably related more to these people kind of dealing with their own egos and all of that, if you want to strip away the murder from it, than I did, whatever was going on in Reality Bites, which was trying to be a movie of the moment and try and capture something.
Reality Bites needed more murder. It needed at least one murder. And we didn't get it.
Marshall, we keep talking over you, dude. Do you have anything you want to pipe in with?
I would just say that, one of the funny things about, I think probably for all of us, this was a transition from sort of mainstream movies, event movies, even, Pulp Fiction. I saw Pulp Fiction and The Crying Game. I saw them at the same Lowe's Spring 10 that I worked at. Those were big movie theaters. This was my literal transition to art house films and foreign films. That I first got into with probably The Piano and Tous les Matins du Monde, which was another Gerard Depardieu movie that I sort of started watching and sort of my introduction to art house films. And this was literally the first movie that opened this, like the second night I worked there. And I think that works for me personally, that works as a quite literal version of the very sort of larger, it's a microcosm of the larger transformation that us and everybody in America is going through at the same time. We're seeing these indie art house films, something that a long time ago most people wouldn't have seen. Your Peter Greenaway movies, for example, they get talked about, but they get talked about in film magazines, and they're not breaking out to the larger culture. Whereas what happens post Reservoir Dogs, post Pulp Fiction, is these movies are breaking out to the larger culture. And we're becoming a part of that. And we're becoming, this happens later than, say, Nirvana breaking open the punk landscape. But it's a very similar dynamic in that the floodgates open and all this weird stuff comes in. And for people who are kids at the time, or I say kids, we were entering college at the time, it's transformative and it feels unprecedented. But in our case, it really was unprecedented. You really had these people becoming overnight celebrities and auteurs that it just hadn't happened for filmmakers like that on this scale. And I think it's hugely important. I mean, even though I think, Michael's point is well taken, the two filmmakers he mentions, Peter Jackson and Danny Boyle, they weren't the kind of you can hear my aesthetic talking to you on your shoulder kind of filmmakers. They definitely were celebrity filmmakers at that time, like and into 2000. That's why Peter Jackson gets to make Lord of the Rings, right? So they definitely did become a part of our discussion, but we all kind of started with them at the same time, and it was exciting, and it was new, and it was crazy. It dovetails nicely with what you were talking about, Ryan, which is at the same time we have a lot of culture that is young single people sharing an apartment, and that's on TV, or that's in the culture, that's in the movies, Reality Bites, that's in, Threesome, which you were talking about. Lots of movies, lots of TV about that. Friends starts in 94. Seinfeld started a little earlier than that, but it's basically the same thing. And it is like, there's money to be made because a lot of people who with a lot of disposable income are also entering that time period, including the three of us. But B, there's just a lot of fertile drama there. A lot of interesting people are making decisions that shape the rest of their lives, and that is important for drama. And that's what I thought, and what I was looking at in here, and we haven't talked about it yet, was the class implications of this movie, which is pretty deep. If you talk about Danny Boyle, you are also talking about the ways class, and obviously UK filmmakers, they live in this water. It's sort of it can be invisible to us as Americans sometimes, the class drama and angst that you have. But that to me is very present in this film. And you start to think about the way class is affecting them. They obviously, unlike the people in Friends and maybe the people, these people can afford this apartment.
Yes,
but
yes.
At the same time, their hold on prosperity is tenuous enough that a bag full of money destroys them. And that is really fascinating to me. You never even find out how much money it is. All you know is that it's enough to, destroy their friendship, whatever there is of it, and destroy them in different ways. And I thought that was fascinating, because you're just never. To me, this is a story about how these three professionals, that it's not an accident that they all are sort of young professionals figuring out how to make a name for themselves in their careers. They feel like they're on the edge of that, probably very much like Danny Boyle felt. Like, how am I gonna hold on to the break that I've got and expand on success? And now this money walks into their lives and disrupts and kills the dreams that they have for themselves. I just think it's a fascinating movie about class, among the other things, the Hitchcockian and the thriller murder mystery tropes that are in here.
Yeah, it's funny. I read a quote from Danny Boyle where he said he was inspired, going into filmmaking, he was inspired by the Godard quote, that all you needed to make a film was a girl and a gun. And since they don't have guns in the UK, they supplant that with money, be that by virtue of class or so forth. And so he makes movies about a girl and money as being the things that are drivers for his characters, and certainly in the stories that he's working with. And probably heroin too. But it makes an appearance in this movie. And it will be a subtle undercurrent of Trainspotting, his next film.
Very so.
Yeah, one of the things that's fascinating here that happens with the characters, and I read some criticism of the film. I read the reviews that came out in my local paper the current reviews for the movie when it came out. And they were very appalled at the violence, and that this was a movie that was not for the weak of heart. You had to really be able to make it, which is funny because I did have a very strong reaction to some of the things that happened in the movie when I saw it, but that was exciting for me. That was part of the roller coaster ride. But going back and watching it this past week, none of it really jumped out at me as being particularly aggressive, I guess is the word I'll use for it.
It wasn't beyond the pale. It wasn't over the top. I felt the same way. I didn't feel I was watching this. This wasn't just, giving me the willies or just disturbing me in any way.
No. And one of the brilliant things that I think happens from a filmmaking point of view in this is that the most gruesome parts of the movie, they do not show you. They do it entirely in silhouette, with smoke. For listeners, I'm going to spoil it a little bit. In order to claim the money, they have to dispose of the body of the dead roommate. And so they draw straws and decide that what they're going to do is dismember him, because Alex, Ewan McGregor's character, works at a tabloid. He knows what the police normally kind of latch onto, which is dental records and fingerprints. So they decide that what they're going to do is saw off the hands and feet and incinerate them. And they're going to remove the corpse's teeth. And then it doesn't really matter if you bury it in a shallow grave, ding, because the body is unidentifiable. And they do that. Well, David, the accountant, very quickly lets them know that he does not have what it takes to do that. And they end up drawing straws. Frankly, none of them have what it takes to do that. They all make that point clear. And they draw straws. And David, who has been the most vocal about not being able to go through with this, now has to saw the hands and feet off of this body and shatter the teeth with a hammer. All things that we've seen them buying at the local hardware store in the scene prior. And they don't show any of it. You hear it, all props to the sound design. And I remember that in the theater, sitting in the theater and hearing this saw on the bone, just going while the characters are in silhouette retching, and this drives David completely over the edge. And that is what is going to cause most of the problems going forward for them, is because he is going to lose it and do that. And then they don't show it. So that was the criticism, was it's very violent and it's very hard to watch for people with weak stomachs. And I didn't get that. It was funny because I watched a movie last night that is very bad that I hope we don't do a podcast on, but it had a scene almost identical to, there's a moment in Shallow Grave where they're trying to get answers out of a fella and they're shoving his face in the water and his eyes bulge out and they're pulling him out and going, "Where's the money?" Lebowski, where's the money? They're shoving him in the water and pulling him out. I saw that scene in a different movie last night and it didn't even faze me. It's just how you shoot that kind of thing. And it's just what bad guys do. But Ryan, you sent me a message right about that same time that I'm watching that, which was.
Yeah. So Jamie had never seen the film. I saw it, I guess, both. I don't remember when I watched it again on VHS, but she'd never seen it, long story short. So we got to the point where the hoods who are looking for Hugo have somehow tracked everything back to this apartment and come bursting through the door and knock Carrie Fox over and smother her with her own sweater and hit Ewan McGregor across the shins with a crowbar. And that was, she just said, "Stop." Stop the movie. And I was like, it's a bit much. And she said, "Yeah, like maybe I'll feel better about it later, but right now I don't want to watch this." I don't know. I didn't really ask her much about, I just, I don't question Jamie to try and push her when she doesn't want to be pushed. I'm not going to talk her into watching something. So, I get it. It's a movie that is very kind of calm until it's not. And that was kind of, in its own way, a bit in the water at the time from things like, I know it's kind of a weird comparison, but like Goodfellas, although everything's kind of tense all the time, when the violence happens, it's got a certain shock or staccato value within the film. And I feel like this movie kind of does the same thing of, the people might all be kind of at each other, even to your point about, the other two making David do this thing. He says, and they do it because he's the weakest one of them. by the time I think we'd gotten definitely through the part where hands had been cut off and teeth knocked out. But I think we just got to actually seeing things. And I think she triggered and said, this is just going to get worse from here. And indeed it was going to get worse. And I knew that. So we stepped away. I don't find the violence in it particularly.
It's not graphic.
No, I mean,
but it's visceral and brutal. That's what struggling with it, because it's like the violence is very effective. It's not like I mean, we're all experienced movie watchers. I mean, so we kind of have lived in, decades and decades of watching similarly violent stuff. And maybe that's why, especially now looking back on this movie, I don't feel as much, but it's very physical and very brutal. And one of the things that I love about this movie is it's certainly not violence for violence sake, the way you get are. This is a movie where people are learning the violence as they go along, and sort of like it's another thing sort of like a way that there's separation between them and people who are normally criminals or normally violent. That separation goes away once their new roommate walks in the door. And from then on, from the moment he dies, they're motivated by the money. They learn how to become violent criminals themselves. And the ways in which the movie comments on that, I think, is so interesting. So I think of the violence as very effective and brutal. And I get why somebody would be queasy about it, especially like the two guys who end up trying to track them down and sort of following their fourth roommate's clues to get to them. They're brutal. I mean, they are trying to extract the information from these hapless other criminals, and they're killing them in some brutal, awful ways. Freezing a guy to death, choking and drowning a guy to death, and the way that they're so sort of nonchalant about it sort of heightens that brutality. I just think that later on, when you see them sort of pantomiming the brutality of the pro criminals, and effectively besting those pro criminals, it's like their competence, their newfound competence at the brutality and the crime is just not. You feel the cost too of that.
Interesting, with the two hoodlums that follow them around. The other mode of death you didn't mention is apparently slamming someone into an ATM machine. Sure.
That's a little bit on the nose in terms of
this movie is
wait, they might kill for money?
The two hoodlums you see commit murders. The three roommates you do not see commit murders. You see them dealing with corpses. There is murder to be committed. That is done off screen. But their handling of the bodies is done on screen, and that's very physical. That's bodies dropping 12 feet out of an attic and just boom, landing on the ground. I will say getting hit in the shins with a crowbar is enough to make that's a reaction. Every guy is used to seeing every screwball comedy where the guy gets, racked and we all go, oh, but getting hit in the shins with a crowbar that's one too. And then chef's kiss to the payoff on that a little bit later when Ewan McGregor's car door closes on his legs. And I just love that so much.
Well, they show him recovering from that, and they actually show all of them kind of recovering. It's like it's something you don't see a lot in the movies is people recovering from their wounds. People actually the way that the violence lasts and really affects them. Again, even since then, that's not something you see a lot in the movies, and I really enjoyed that. I mean,
I think the movie does a good job of to that point. There's it does follow a lot of rules in the right way, and that there's sort of Chekhov's shin bone, and there's also Juliet's terrible shoes that she wears through this whole movie that they kind of draw your attention to in a way. It's strange to me, but I notice that she's wearing these weird not doctor shoes. At some point, she's shown taking them off and putting them on at a couple of points across the movie, just as a character thing. But she's sure going to reach for that shoe later at the end of the movie, and you're going to go, "Oh yeah, I've seen that. You've showed it to me 3 times, and now it is going to lead to one last terrible moment for the audience. You know, I think it's an
so
excellent movie.
So many payoffs built on small details. There's just a lot. It's a very detail-oriented movie, and you're right. There's a lot of little payoffs that reward close watching.
Yeah, it's just a tiny turn of the screw through the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the point with which Jamie jumped out is it's fascinating to me because that is sort of where it's kind of coming to a head. I feel like she misses the payoff of that a bit. Because I don't want to watch, Ewan McGregor's face in a bag or as he struggles to breathe. I don't want to watch that in a film either. Right. I don't want to watch funny games all of a sudden.
Yeah.
With this, that's not pleasurable to me, but that situation, it's so funny. It settles itself so quickly, but it puts our characters on an even worse path from there.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of uncorks the ability for all of them to maybe, perform murder. I mean, it's a fascinating thing that Juliet does go from, I'm a doctor and I can't disassemble a body, to at the end, I'm going to stab David through the back of the neck. And by the way, I'm going to hammer this kitchen knife, so hard that you're stuck to the floor now. I mean, they've obviously all gone through the change that occurred. They had the initial change there, but then there's this, I mean, if you were to sit and map out who's aligning themselves with whom and how that's changing on a line by line basis through the last 30 minutes of the film, you'd be exhausted. It's absolutely bananas.
Do you guys feel like those character changes are motivated? Because that's a criticism. That is like the prime criticism of the movie. And first of all, people don't seem to understand 1994 or 1995 movie reviewers, at least, didn't seem to understand why David suddenly loses his mind. And I'm like, did you miss the part where he had to do something gruesome?
I thought that was made really clear as he's like, you can see him transforming the violence is against dead bodies, but that's one of those things that I think that class issues here, like their jobs are not manual labor. And all of a sudden they're out there in the middle of nowhere with freaking saws, bone saws and hammers, trying to do something that's very, very manual labory, even though it's the machinery of death. I mean, Ewan McGregor, a journalist, is pushing a car into a ravine. It's like they're pantomiming the things they see on movies because this is what you do, the perfect crime. Well, what this movie makes, I thought really is fascinating. It's work. It is work to do this shit. Yeah. and they really make the physicality of that come across, especially for people who typically have the kinds of jobs, accountant, journalist, doctor, that don't involve that,
the movies usually would do like a pop of a plastic sheet in slow motion and then the shot of them rolling it and taping it, while sad music plays, and then them dumping the body into a body of water or something. Like you do miss this sucks.
Yeah. And at the same time, this is awful. It comes across though, because it's like they set out to they're like, what do we do? How do we commit the perfect crime? They're three really smart people, and they kind of do commit the perfect crime. In the end, you think about it, even though the cops are onto them, the crime isn't really solved. It's very difficult to figure out who the identity of these people are or figure out whether they did it. And that comes across too. I love that there's like the labor that they do has a cost, and that the work that they do, the fact that they're smart, they really turn out to be smart in some important ways, even while they turn out to be dumb in some important ways. It's like their scheme overall really does work, and you sort of realize the reason it doesn't work is because of them. It isn't because they didn't think it through or execute correctly. It's really because of the mistakes each of them make in terms of relating to themselves and betraying each other.
Yeah, there's a kind of a definition of like what is noir, and that's something that we talk about a lot in the noir podcast. And I think that in that way, this movie is classic noir. It's what we got in over our head with something, and it's going to be whatever's wrong with us internally is going to be what ends up tripping us up in the end. It's double indemnity, right? And with that line where Juliet says to Ewan McGregor, "But you're smarter than David, so you'll be fine." And he's like, "Yeah, I am." Like, you can just see him go, like, "Yeah, I'll be great because I am." She observes this about me with this thing that is true. It's in some ways it's a little over the top. In some ways it's also the kind of perfect, like, watching Juliet just play these guys over and over and over.
Mm-hmm. I will say, I don't tend to fixate on plot holes. It makes absolutely no sense how the hoodlums find them.
Or the cops.
It makes almost no sense how the cops find them. But I will forgive it in this instance. One, because I picked the movie and I can. And
Yep.
Two, because when those characters show up, in as much as you are in the audience going, how did you figure that out? Like, what would have led you to the quarry where you've dumped that car? Like, they show them go there first, and you're like, how would you have done that? So it doesn't make any sense in the narrative structure, but it does put the audience exactly in the same, asking the same questions that the three characters are asking. We committed a perfect crime. How would you have wound up here? Why are you, a police officer, sitting on my couch asking me questions that we as the audience know are absolutely there to trick them up? The police officer asks him, would it surprise you to learn that his car is parked outside? And they handle that question perfectly. But what I find to be unique is the plot holes make you ask the same questions that the characters should probably ask of themselves. So they get kind of a pass on that one.
Yeah. Well, and we've sort of buried this thus far, but this is a comedy. There's some great lines that kind of result from how awful these people are and how they start tripping each other up. As you mentioned, Ryan, that you're smarter than him. You'll be fine. She's sort of subtly manipulating him, but how is she manipulating him? Really, that sort of sets up the twist at the end, right? It's sort of like that. Does it motivate that? Does it click for him? Does he figure out, okay, this is how I'm gonna fix this? But it's really ironic for the audience because he's been the dumbest character up to that point.
Sure.
Like, the audience there has no confidence in that guy being the smartest because he is just a dimwit, practically confessing his crime at the hardware store. It's like he can't be quiet. He can't be cool under pressure. He can't sit there without tipping off the cops at the press conference. He's a dumbass every step of the way until the end. I won't give away the end.
A huge superiority complex, right?
Yeah, with the huge, exactly. Yeah. He's just a pompous ass, And at the same time, though, you really also get a feel for how smart they are and how how they get away with a perfect crime, because Juliet's a doctor and she can incinerate, but they're mining those relationships for comedy. Like, one of my favorite lines in this whole movie is when she says, but Juliet, you're a doctor, you kill people every day. I was like trying to argue over who should be the one to carry this out. She's like, it's different. It's not, it's amazing. The comedy and the number and the line readings. And I really want you, Michael and Ryan, to talk about these cops, man, because the two cops are just great. I would watch a show of these guys all by themselves. Like, if you spun this off into a 10-episode show, I want it to be about these two cops.
Yeah, that there are two police officers who are hot on the trail, who show up, and their method is to sit there and let you stew in your discomfort at their presence. And what will that reveal? And so not a lot of dialogue for those guys, but their sort of back and forth is also very, very understated. And the lead police officer at one point asks them, which one does he ask? He asks David, right? He asks David, the accountant, who are the 4 roommates that live in this place? And he says, well, there's only 3 roommates. And they say, it's unfortunate to get, faulty information. So go ahead and write down that there were, they want to write down that there are 4 roommates that he said that there were only 3, and the other police officer asked him whether he wanted him to write the number 4 or spell out the word 4. And the response is 4. They do have a very, very dry.
Right, both the number and the letter, right?
That's right. Yeah, it's very dry, and its purpose there is to just maybe entertain the audience, but you get the impression that they solve crimes this way. I don't know. Maybe that's
it's a really
the detective we're waiting for.
Yeah, it's the thing that that they've counted on everything they think they will need to be able to do, but they haven't been able to really process what it would mean to get grilled actually about anything. I mean, they just thought that they'd gotten away with it. So they haven't put any of that forethought that they did with, well, we'll knock out the teeth, we'll cut off the hands. Doesn't mean that the cops aren't going to show up at your door. So what happens when they actually do? And in the kind of almost Columbo-esque, we're asking everything from it, what's the word? What kind of angle am I thinking of here? Doesn't matter. But asking everything at angles instead of straight on, they're just sweating them out. I did think it kind of showed, a lack of imagination on the part of the guys as they're getting grilled. They could have said, they could have called the ambulance and had them take Hugo away and had a drug in and just hidden the money at that point. They could have said Hugo was here. He was doing drugs, so we kicked him out. We don't know where he is now. There were a lot of different things they could have done to throw the cops off the trail. But I accept that those were the answers based on who those characters were. And I thought the bit about the car being outside was particularly a good little scene.
A little piece of trivia about those scenes with the police officers. The film ran out of money, and they were not getting any more money to finish the movie. And so they filmed those scenes with the police officers sitting side by side on the couch with just a reverse of whomever they're talking to, because they had sold all the rest of the furniture and props in the apartment to pay for the last reels of celluloid that were needed to finish shooting the movie. Those scenes
is some 90s filmmaking right there, man.
Those
that
scenes
is
were
so
shot
90s.
last, and the furniture that you see is all that was left.
Yeah.
It brings up, though, one of the cool things I like about it, and I guess it can't have been this is right when Real World is just, we're in the early seasons of Real World, but it's funny how many reality show beats there are to this thing that are sort of like that. It's not copying them. It's sort of setting the template. Like those feel very interviewy, those feel very, so tell me about what's going on. It's like the way those interviews set out. And then the weird alliances, it's like looking back, I'm like, where have I seen this? Like so-and-so is aligning with whom? This is Survivor, this is like, there's some reality, like watching this back. And obviously I don't think it's inspired by that, but it has this kind of it sets up this premise of like, who's going to outsmart who and who's going to be the last one standing. That is very Survivor, Celebrity, what's the Bachelor. It's very much like that. It sets up a kind of contest that I don't think it hit home for me in the 90s, but certainly it hit home for me now. That's what this is.
I'm sure you're right. I don't really know, because I watch cinema, and we watch this Survivor.
I didn't mean to drag you through the TV ghetto there. I'm sorry. This is, to me, that's one of the things I kept coming back to when I was watching this, is that there's this is what life is like when friends stop being polite and start being real. And then, they put them in a fabulous apartment and give them everything that they want and watch them self-destruct. This is Real World. This is kind of real worldly, and we're in that time period.
Well, yeah. Let me steer this just a little bit. I have one more piece of trivia about the movie that I found to be absolutely fascinating, which is at the end of the film, they take David's body and they zip it. They put a sheet over it and they push it into the freezers. that is a real morgue. It was an active morgue, and there are bodies in all of those other boxes. And Christopher Eccleston said, much like his character, I can't do this. And the solution that they finally came up with was they took one of the hands, one of the grips or someone, and, a props person or someone, and put them inside the cooler so that when it got pushed in and they closed the door, he would not be alone in there with dead people. And Danny Boyle says you can hear on the soundtrack that person saying, "It's okay, Chris, I'm here." I did not go back to see if that's true. It's certainly a great story, but I just thought it was funny that a little bit of method acting on the part of Christopher Eccleston right there. But with the time that we have left, I just wanted to ask you guys. So we talked about me and my time, and Marshall, you kind of touched on this, that it was sort of your literal transition to the art house. But I'm just curious, as guys who watch movies, when you think of a time that is not necessarily attached to movies your loved one took you to go see, or movies that you went to see because you were interested in, whoever you were romantically attached to at the time, like when did the movies sort of become something that was modern and now? Because I was certainly watching old movies then. We had already devoured the entire video store. We were running over to Audio Video Plus around the corner, or to Cactus around the other corner, and renting movies and just chewing them up, but they were all older. And so the thing that stood out for me for Shallow Grave was this was a time when it felt like the good movies were happening right in front of me. And I'm just curious, when was that for y'all?
So mine was actually at the River Oaks, I guess. I was driving down to the River Oaks when I was in high school. That was not an uncommon thing. I saw Crying Game, I think the second week it was out. And I have a whole story about that. That will mean something more to Marshall, as he knows the players involved. But
I know all there is to know about the Crying Game.
So I went to go see Slacker. I just moved away from Austin, and
wow,
there was this movie that took place in Austin, and my mom, of all people, was like, me and my brother, do you guys want to see this thing? I want to see Austin in a movie. She'd taken me to see Beverly Hills Cop in 4th grade because we'd lived in Detroit at one point, and she heard Detroit was in the movie. So I saw Beverly Hills Cop in the theater, week 1. So yeah, that was kind of the start of it. I mean, I kind of was aware that there were like good classic movies, and then I was kind of aware there was art house because Austin was a smaller city back then, and the Village, which is now in Alamo, back then was an art house. And my parents had accidentally taken me to see Paul McCartney's "Give My Regards to Broadway" or whatever it was, Broad Street. And occasionally we'd go see a movie there. There was, the Coen brothers, Raising Arizona, I think had shown there, and a few other things. Austin was really easy to get around. But I think really the something is happening thing was almost like seeing Roger and Me in the theater and seeing Slacker. And it happened, I guess, a few years earlier for me. And I very much, there was another theater that was downtown Houston that I couldn't tell you where it is, because in my memory, it's next to where the Rockets used to play.
The Greenway.
Oh, yeah.
I worked there. I worked for all the Landmark too.
And I'd go down there and see films when I was in high school. So yeah, it was just kind of in the water for me a bit. But this one felt like it was part of the continuum. I think when I saw it, the ones that really hit me over the head, we'll end up covering them on the podcast at some point, was when I was 14 or 15. I was up in DC for my uncle's wedding, and he only owned like 3 movies, and that was Godfather 1, Godfather 2, and Das Boot. And so he showed all of those to us, and he just like, okay, boys, we have 4 hours to kill while the adults are doing things. Go watch Das Boot. And so that kind of got me started off for sure.
Yeah. For me, it happened a little earlier. I would say this started in 1992 with like The Crying Game. The big one for me that just sort of started me going to art house movie theaters in general was and going down to River Oaks 3 and getting me addicted to that was Like Water for Chocolate. That's a big movie for me. I remember it fondly. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. That one and The Piano, which was a shout out and plug for the earlier podcast I did with Ryan on the piano. But those were two movies that were big for me in terms of sort of getting me turned on to seeing stuff in the smaller theaters and seeing sort of foreign flicks and overseas films and smaller movies. Like eventually Bottle Rocket, there's a progression in the 90s where you sort of go through and you start seeing all the stuff that comes out, but eventually it's a habit, right? You start going to movies at the River Oaks and you see the trailer and you go, that one, and you see it just became a thing for me. But that, like Ryan, that started for me in high school. I started driving, my friends and I, we used to drive down from and we were from the suburbs, and it was what 35 minutes out of downtown, Ryan? I mean,
at least, yeah.
It was 35 minutes, 40 minutes out of downtown. And so you had to trek down there. We'd make a night at that. Me and my friends, we'd hit the movies, we'd hit Cyrano's, a coffee house on at Richmond and Montrose by the library. We'd go see jazz at that jazz club. I think Cezanne's was what it was called. We felt very grown up, doing the very grown up things like seeing art house films and going to see jazz and going to the coffee house. It sounds pretentious as hell, and it kind of was.
Oh yeah,
so illuminating and fun, and that was what we did. And that created a very, I would say, all the way through the 90s. I basically, because I worked at movie theaters and was so into movies, I saw everything that came out that whole decade. And I didn't do that on into the next decades. I'm not as big of a film junkie now as I was then, but I saw everything. I read the film mags. I was into it. And that's part of the reason the films that I've done with Ryan, when I've done a podcast, tends to be that early to mid 90s sweet spot for me that I have the fondest memories that made the biggest impact on me.
It's funny, The Crying Game has come up so many times. I saw that in the theater. It made no impression on me, I think. Other than to say, I saw that. I think I'd seen A Room with a View, Shadowlands, some of these movies that felt art housey in their way. And while I definitely think, obviously, we can fill an hour talking about Shallow Grave or whatever, there's a populist, what I felt like, these movies didn't require me to understand art quite in the same way that I think some of those others did. And that may be what I'm responding to, it sounds like, Ryan, with you, it sounds like once we kind of had the indie explosion of the mid 90s, you were the kid who was just like, yeah, welcome to what I've been doing.
I mean, sort of not. I mean, there was enough other people around, and I have older siblings, which changes the picture for everything, right? I have an older brother, and he was, with driver's license, we were all over town. Austin was very easy to get around and very safe when I was, it's still very safe, but very easy to get around back then. And so, going to, any of the movie theaters was not, a huge deal. And then in Houston, my parents basically knew I'd go insane unless they let me just drive all over the place. And I drove all the time in high school. So if anyone, it was as much of a thing of like, oh, I get to drive if we were going to go to River Oaks or what was it, the Greenway or whatever. But yeah, I mean, it was just an option for whatever we were doing. I was certainly kind of getting a little disenchanted with action movies to some extent at that point. My dad was still the one who was like, ooh, Wesley Snipes has something new out. I was like, okay, I guess I'm seeing Passenger 57 tonight, which was fine. But my interest at that point, I'm also reading Beckett and, being pretentious as shit, at this point in my life. And so it kind of fit with that, but it's how you start to explore what's beyond your Spring, Texas boundaries of what does the rest of the world have to offer. which I think the best educators are, kind of pushing you to understand those things. And I was a drama kid in high school. I took art classes, and, we're down at the Houston museums all the time and going to the Alley Theater. Houston, if you're not from there, don't know it, is an amazing city. It has so freaking much to offer. Austin's a fun town. Austin does not have those things that the oil boom brought to Houston. World-class opera, and now the food scene in Houston's exploded too. So aside from the fact it's a swamp, it's an amazing city. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I certainly never felt like it's so much like I was welcoming people to join me, because one of the things that I always found, especially as an insecure teenager, and that lasted till I was 25, was always being aware of how much I didn't know. And so, like, I've never seen in my life water for chocolate.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. And so people would say that, and I just kind of nod sagely, but I was like, fuck, I haven't seen that movie. I'm just got to keep my mouth shut till we start talking about a movie I have seen. But yeah, I was running down there to go see, Naked Lunch, which I got yelled at, driving everyone home. The other three people were not happy.
I can think of at least two things wrong with that title.
But yeah, so I always appreciated hearing what I should be going to see and all that. But it was a crazy time. Like, you could not see like Water for Chocolate because there was just so much stuff at the theater at that point. So
I'll tie back to what Marshall said, when he talked a little bit about, Nirvana. So in that situation, I was with the kids that were listening to weird stuff. We knew who these bands were. And we were not popular for it. And then it happened, and it was on Saturday Night Live, and it was on the radio. And I am not an elitist at all. I'm not a person who would sit there and say like, oh, I was listening to him long before you were. But I did feel that I got to experience culture kind of coming around to what I liked. And I think when it comes to movies, even though I love them, I'm a little bit more on the other side. Like, I'm a little bit more discovering it after, I didn't see Reservoir Dogs in the theater until it was released on the popularity of Pulp Fiction,
Mm-hmm.
And I had seen it, but when it comes to the movies, even though I love them and so forth, I was a little bit more on the wave who was like, oh, what you guys got here? Walking into the River Oaks or walking into an art house theater. I also had a lot of deprogramming to do when it came to what was like, quote unquote, art house, just because I think my parents, my father specifically, every now and then, his opinions would be like, oh, well, you have to be intellectual to like Woody Allen, for example. And, I had a friend who showed me a lot of movies my freshman year of college, and I kind of adopted a little bit of the language of my father. I was like, I don't really like Woody Allen, and that's just me trying to hang in the conversation by having an opinion. And he was like, what? That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Sits me down in his apartment and makes me watch a couple of Woody Allen movies from across sort of the spectrum of things that he does. And, 15 minutes into one of those movies, you're like, oh, I haven't read all these books, but these jokes sure are funny, and you realize how accessible it is. So I had to go through a bit of that deprogramming, I think, to feel like, and it could be that a movie like Shallow Grave, because I didn't have to work through anything, because I could just watch it and go like, that's exciting. And then it's over, and I understood it, and I walked out, and it was showing at this place that it was an art house movie. It felt like everything was kind of gelling for me right there, like it made sense. And I don't know, maybe it is inaccessible for some, and I had just finally kind of learned my lesson, and that was the thing. But also I just felt like there was no longer a divide, and I'm not going to attribute that to this movie specifically, but there was no longer a divide between like the kinds of movies you see over here and the kinds of movies you can see over there, in that the ones that you see at the little theater are less entertaining in some form or fashion, like, or not. Like, this movie was like, hey, we can be as violent and edgy and funny and whatever as these other movies, but we're going to do it with a little more flair, perhaps.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I don't remember specifically like what they were actually showing at the Village till in Austin until I got kind of old enough. And then certainly when I came back in college and we were there all the time. But I do think that there was a thing that was going on in movie criticism that my cousin is 17 years older than me. And very much, God bless her, but she always wanted to be perceived as an intellectual. And so, yeah, she would kind of, I'm going to see the latest Woody Allen movie. You wouldn't understand it, you and your Star Wars. I am also at this point, like 14 or 13 or whatever, going, yeah, okay. Not a problem. But I think that there was a certain way that people looked at movies, and I think you can see it in those criticisms you were talking about, how the movies are written up as to, this is not what I expect out of my art house film. How dare this thing be so violent, or show violence in some way. And that's what I was thinking about when you were talking about that, was the Tweety guys who were, kind of the gatekeepers of what made good film. Because I remember watching Siskel and Ebert, and it would be like, we're going to talk about Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead, and then we're going to talk about My Dinner with Andre. And, of course, they'd eat up and I was like, but where the hell is My Dinner with Andre playing? Like, where what's this movie? I was like, I know where to go see my, Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead. That's showing at the Showplace 6 right near my house. I can pedal over there. But there was, I think you can see it in old Siskel and Ebert reviews and their old shows. Ebert is actually fascinating to go back and read his reviews. Like, that guy got it like way earlier than other people. But Siskel, I think, was kind of much more of the kind of, this is for a certain audience, and I belong to the intellectual elite of America. But I can understand you plebes, in flyover space aren't going to quite get this. So. And, when I started in film school, I don't know how it was at U of H, but, that was the whole, putting it on the slab thing was, what have you seen? But also kind of my understanding of, this is not, there's not a correct answer here. Like, I had good friends who were introducing me simultaneously to Jackie Chan and, Michelle Yeoh, while I'm also learning about, what's going on with, French New Wave cinema. And I'm like, it's the smorgasbord, and you can, kind of pick from whatever you want. Meanwhile, Tarantino, who's just regurgitating things other people have done, is completely blowing up. It was a fascinating time to be alive, kids. You should have been there.
Well, my main beef with indie cinema and art house cinema in general is that I definitely 100% was hanging out with Marshall at this time, and I have zero memories of that dude getting me into the movie theater for free.
Yeah,
you bastard.
That did not happen.
I don't know. I can't remember. I definitely got people into the movie theater for free. I know that I don't think I had met you when Shallow Grave came out, but for sure we were friends after that in 95 and 96. And I don't know. I feel like I probably did, but maybe that's just me going. Maybe did Ryan use the same way? Did I ever get you into the movie theater for free? I remember I did. I got some people in for free.
It's possible. What I remember was Justin, who does some of the other podcasts on here, was the manager of 2 different theaters in Austin up north. And I would just be on the list, me and my brother, and the people were just like, oh, here's the Steens brothers showing up again to watch, whatever, because we'd go to anything because it was all free. We just used and abused all of that, but I don't remember specifically getting in free because, when I came back to Houston, by the time it was 95, 96, I wasn't going down to River Oaks a ton.
Yeah. And you were in Austin. I had gone to Baylor, and then I came back to go to North Harris for a semester for a year. And then I went to U of H. But that's where I met Michael, but Ryan, you definitely did not get me into the movie theater for free, but you definitely got me into films. You were part of my education there, sort of watching Slackers at your house, watching Miller's Crossing at your house. You were the reason why I remember when I saw The Crying Game, I was like, wait a minute, is this Gabriel Byrne? Like a generation of people can't tell Gabriel Byrne and Stephen Ray apart. And that's why. It's like if you're watching indie movies at this time, they might as well be the same person. And you're like, I don't know if these guys are the same. But I just remember that confusion. I was like, wait, is this the same guy from Miller's Crossing? And by the way, it's not. But you definitely have that kind of confusion. And I blame you.
I will say the answer for the movie that changed everything for me, and I'm going to talk about it in a podcast eventually. I'll do it at some point. Is Miller's Crossing?
Oh my god!
And that was we'd gone down to the Galleria to see something, and I saw the trailer for it, and I was like, "This is the most incredible trailer I've ever seen in my life." And I was coming right off The Godfather at this point, and but I don't know if it ever actually showed in Houston, because I remember looking for it because they also showed the trailer at Lowe's. And I was expecting it to come out mainstream, and it just didn't. And so the first time I ever saw it available was on VHS. So
I saw it at your house. I mean, I would say, like, I never saw it in the theater either. I saw it at your house, and it blew, like, you knew, like, you showed it to me, and you're like, this movie is going to blow your mind. And it totally did. Made me like a fan of that. I even think I'd seen Raising Arizona with like my parents on VHS, but Miller's Crossing is just like that's a mind blower for you. Yeah. Whenever I saw it, 92 maybe.
Yeah, I agree. I probably saw it in the same way and around the same time. I can't remember that movie really being out that I haven't seen it and that I haven't been impressed with it. And it's just so rich, and you can go into it forever. It was years later once Fargo, and those movies were coming out, there were enough of these movies that we're talking about that PBS did a special on, like, the indie filmmaker. And they mentioned the Coen brothers, and I was like, oh, of course, Fargo, Miller's Crossing. And I had not connected them really to, like, Raising Arizona, for whatever reason. And they're talking about the just slapdash chaotic filmmaking style that was their early years. And I'm writing all this down. I was like, I knew of Raising Arizona. It didn't dawn on me that would be like an independent film in the way that it's executed. Right. And then the way that they approached it and so forth, and that it would fit in with all these other things. To tie it back a little bit, I was talking about the Coen brothers. Shallow Grave has a great little moment, hat tip to Blood Simple, when David's up in the attic and all the beams of light are coming up through him are just like the, Blood Simple when he shoots through the walls, and you get the same effect, which in that same documentary, Marty Scorsese or someone was like, I cannot believe I never thought of this. I cannot believe that I traffic in bullet holes and it never dawned on me to shine light through one of them into a dark room.
Well, we have talked for like an hour and a half, so we should probably relieve people and let them go. But any last thoughts on the film before we jump off?
Is this where I ditch out and I say, by the way, Shawshank Redemption sucks, and then I just nope out of the movie? Like,
oh, right.
That's
yeah,
that's the new feature. That's the new hot feature I want, Marshall. Yeah. that whoever called the movie gets to say one last thing, and then the last thing you hear on the podcast is everyone going, "Wait, what?" I say thank you for allowing me to participate. It's fun to go from being listener to contributor. And it's always great to spend time with you guys in person, and I'll see you on the computer soon enough.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And Marshall, thanks for jumping in, man. Really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
about wraps it up for this edition of The Signal Watch, a production of the League of Melbotus. Thanks for sticking with us. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to drop on by the Signal Watch blog, where you'll find write-ups of a wide variety of movies and more. We'd love to hear from you, so find us online and let us know what you think. Whether you prefer email, blog comments, or social media, we'll be happy to hear from you. We'll be back soon with more exceedingly high-quality content. So, until next time, God damn it, babies, you've got to be kind.